World War soldier poets is brought to life.
Now in my dial of glass appears the soldier who is going to die. He smiles and moves about in ways his mother knows. The wires touch his face. I cry, now! Death, like a familiar hears and look, has made a man of dust, of a man of flesh. And in the mad, tormented valley, where blood and hunger rally, and death the wild beast is uncaught, untamed, our soul withstands the terror, and has its quiet honour among the glittering stars your voices named. How easy it is to make a ghost.
Mention war poetry, and most people think of the poetry of the First World War, the poetry of Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon and Isaac Rosenberg. And for some reason, there is much less interest in the achievement of the Second World War poets. In this program, we want to commemorate and to celebrate the lives and the poetry of two very fine poets, Keith Douglas and Alun Lewis.
Lewis was a reluctant soldier who never fired a shot in anger. Douglas saw war as a test of nerve. He fought in the thick of two of the major battles of World War II. The war gave them both a bitter inspiration for their poetry and claimed both their lives. In the North African desert, Tank Commander Keith Douglas lined up with the 8th Army against Rommel's Afrika Korps.
Keith said he didn't think he would see the end of the war. He seemed obsessed with this sort of thing, really. But it drove him on, I think, you know, because he was an outstanding man at going forward. You see, Keith was a tear-about man. When he was in his tank, he was looking out the top. He loved it.
What's so fascinating about Douglas is he's a very, very clever man. He's a very, very gifted artist, a marvellously gifted poet, and yet he's also a sportsman. He likes action. He is raring to be part of the battle.
This man of action seized every moment to record his experiences of war. He sketched and painted the carnage. He wrote intense poetry, full of clinically observed detail about the Desert War.
There's something in Douglas's imagination that obviously responded to the desert. Its austerity, its space, its cleanness, its emptiness. This is very strongly part of his poems, and it attracts him immensely. This is one of Douglas's most haunting poems, Vergiss mich nicht, which means forget me not in German. 3 weeks gone, and the combatants gone, returning over the nightmare ground, we found the place again and found the soldier sprawling in the sun. Look, here in the gun pit spoil, the dishonoured picture of his girl, who has put Steffi, vergiss mich nicht, in a copybook, Gothic script. But she would weep to see today how on his skin the swart flies move, the dust upon the paper eye, and the burst stomach like a cave.
Keith Douglas was an only child, born in Kent in 1920. His father left home when Keith was 8, never to be seen again.
No, they had nothing at all. Keith had a very rough childhood, in fact.
His father had served in the First World War, and Keith was fascinated by all things military. Spending much of his childhood alone, he played obsessively with toy soldiers. A precociously talented artist, he loved to paint soldiers and battle scenes.
He was very lucky to go to a school like Christ's Hospital, where it didn't matter how much money you had, and he was very clever.
Christ's Hospital provided a traditional public school education for children whose parents could not afford one. For Keith Douglas, it gave a structure and security lacking at home. The school recognized and fostered his exceptional talent, but there was a defiance about him.
He was an outsider, you see. He was entitled to be an outsider because of his strange gifts, whereas others of us weren't outsiders in the same way. He was the sort of person who didn't give a toss, and this in a hierarchically organised and very disciplined school.
But it was in the Officers' Training Corps that Keith Douglas the loner found a sense of purpose.
Keith was the sergeant in charge, and he boned up on the drill and so forth. And he was very funny, but he was also a martinet, you know. Imagine a boy of about 16 insisting that one had one's bayonet scabbard shining, one's boots and puttees. I mean, we were still dressed like soldiers of the 14-18 war. It seemed absolutely certain that it was going to have to be done again. There was a sense of anticipation, really.
When he left school in 1937, tension was mounting again in Europe. He wrote about the end of an era.
On leaving school, and at this evening moment, when the shallow echoes stagger against big school, it is awkward. Realizing happiness seems just to have started, and now we must leave it.
Here is an announcement. At 11:15, that is in about 2 minutes, the Prime Minister will broadcast to the nation.
I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
Keith Douglas was at Oxford when war was declared. He spent the rest of his time there, waiting to be called up.
Undergraduate life is always intense, but for Keith Douglas and his generation, it was extremely intense. He was here at Oxford from 1938 to 1940, haunted by the idea of the First World War, knowing survivors of that war, attending parties, taking part in plays, having love affairs, painting and drawing and writing poetry.
I went to visit him in Merton, and we were given the Douglas treatment, you know, and told about some of the girls and his plans for them. He took great pains to knock over this box, this perfume box, which fell on the floor conveniently to display all these condoms, you see, which had the impression that he designed it to have. And that was the kind of person he was.
He said to me, "You wouldn't dare go out with me, would you?" That was sort of, and I said, "Okay, where are we going?"
He once, not very flatteringly I suppose, said he wished I had been his sister.
Oh.
Douglas fell in love with a Chinese student. She inspired him to write and paint, but even in love he had premonitions of death.
Today, Cheng, I touched your face with 2 fingers as a gesture of love, for I can never prove enough by sight or sense your strange grace. But mothwise my hands return to your fair cheek, as luminous as a lamp in a paper house, and touch to teach love and learn.
Beautifully it picks up a famous line of John Donne's, "A bracelet of bright hair about the bone." But alas, Cheng, I cannot tell why today I touched a mask stretched on the stone-hard face of death. There was the urge to escape the bright flesh and emerge of the ambitious cruel bone. He's thinking of death, of the battlefield.
In one of his last undergraduate poems, Douglas toys with the idea that this would be his last summer alive, and that if he returned to Oxford, it would be as a ghost. This poem captures a sense of foreboding, of ominousness. It's the River Thames, it's the River Styx.
Well, I'm thinking, this may be my last summer, but cannot lose even a part of pleasure in the old-fashioned art of idleness. Whistle, and I will hear, and come another evening when this boat travels with you alone towards Iffley, as you lie looking up for thunder again. This cool touch does not betoken rain. It is my spirit that kisses your mouth lightly.
I had lunch with him on the last day that he was in Oxford, and he took off his watch and he took off his scarf. He had a pretty cherry-coloured silk scarf, and he took them off and put them across the table and said, "You keep those, you're going to be killed." And he asked me to promise that I would always do my best to get his poetry known.
A few months later, in 1941, Keith Douglas was in the North African desert, training for tank warfare. The impecunious son of a housekeeper, he found himself sharing the mess with the officers of the Sherwood Rangers. The regiment had seen distinguished action in the First World War. Their commanding officers were aristocrats, a Tory MP, and the heir to the Clare tobacco fortune.
Keith Douglas was fascinated and at times exasperated by the aristocrats who commanded him. Here he describes Guy, the second in command. He was charming and entirely obsolete. His ideas were feudal in the best sense. He regarded everyone in the regiment as his tenants, subtenants, serfs, etc., and felt his responsibilities to them like a landlord. His moustache was an exact replica of those worn by the heroes of the Boer War.
In such privileged company, Keith Douglas found it hard to fit in.
He wasn't mad keen on sort of excessive discipline. Occasionally I used to say, for Christ's sake, Keith, be quiet. It's none of your business. You've got to learn to buckle under sometimes.
Douglas, the critical outsider, was sent back to Alexandria to a routine job teaching camouflage. The rest of the regiment was gearing up for action. On the eve of 23rd of October 1942, the Battle of El Alamein began. 6 days into the battle, Douglas could stand it no longer. He commandeered a lorry to rejoin his comrades. It was an act of disobedience which in less desperate times could have resulted in court-martial.
He says, the Battle of Alamein began on the 23rd of October 1942. 6 days afterwards, I set out in direct disobedience of orders to rejoin my regiment. My batman was delighted with this manoeuvre. I like you, sir, he said. You're shit or bust you are. This praise gratified me a lot.
Douglas escaped without punishment. The regiment had lost 16 of its 22 officers and needed reinforcements. It was his first taste of war, and he found it exhilarating.
By the time they'd done their training and seen what happened, they weren't worrying about killing anybody. It was war.
Douglas described the sights he'd seen. His style is typically unemotional.
The gunner of a tank which had been hit, shaken by the impact of the shell, the sight of one of his friends beheaded and another bleeding from a great wound, has forgotten his wireless procedure, if ever he knew it. Meanwhile, the gunner must try to get the unconscious corporal out, because the tank is burning and because he is bleeding to death. Not nice, was it?
If a mortar shell burst, a few yards shrapnel, if that hit him in the chest, I mean, he could have his gut opened right through the backbone nearly. The man may have been just gasping for his last breath, and you said the prayer with a mark on his brow and held his hand maybe till he died.
How to kill. Under the parabola of a ball, a child turning into a man. I looked into the air too long. The ball fell in my hand. It sang in the closed fist. Open, open. Behold a gift designed to kill. Now in my dial of glass appears the soldier who is going to die. He smiles and moves about in ways his mother knows, habits of his. The wires touch his face. I cry, no! Being damned, I am amused to see the centre of love diffused, and the waves of love travel into vacancy. How easy it is to make a ghost. Terrifying poem, that sense of being damned, the sense of what it's like to be a killing machine, and to know that you're more than a machine, that you have a spirit, and there is a curse on you because you're committing murder.
For the Welsh poet Alun Lewis, the Second World War meant the Burmese jungle. War brought Lewis emotional torment which he poured into his verse. He was tortured by his heartfelt conviction that it was wrong to kill, but he was serving in an infantry regiment and was only days away from frontline action against the Japanese.
Alun's fear of war was not a fear of being killed, which was what most of us would experience. He always told me on several occasions that his fear was of having to kill somebody else and wondering whether he could do it.
He was a first-rate subaltern, and the men worshipped him and would have followed him anyway. But he was a poet. Didn't go with fixed bayonets, did it, really?
And now the Sitang River was there at last, and the shambles of trucks and corpses round the bridge, and the bridge was blown, and he laughed, and then a cough of bullets, a dusty cough, filleted all his thigh from knee to groin. The kick of it sucked his face into the wound. He crumpled, thinking death. Alun Lewis was born in 1915 in Cumaman, a small coal mining village in mid-Glamorgan. Lewis was the eldest of 4 children. Their father was a teacher, but for generations his family had been miners. His strong sense of justice and identification with the working class came from these roots.
Oh, he was a lovely little boy, a little gentleman. He was a real, well, they were all good children. She had 4 children and they were marvellous, all of them. If anybody was in want or anything, they always helped everybody. They were very good. They were better off than us.
The Depression hit Cumaman in the early 1920s. While Alun Lewis was at primary school, he watched the indignity of proud men out of work and scavenging for coal. It made a lasting impression.
Life in the valleys was extremely hard. All the children were lined up whose parents were on the dole and given boots, because otherwise they couldn't come to school. Free boots, free soup. But the other side of it was it welded the South Wales community into a family. I mean, if you had anything, you shared it. I mean, Alun Lewis was very much part of the Valley syndrome.
When he was 11, he had to leave the valley he loved. He'd won a scholarship of £20 and a place at a boarding school at Cowbridge, but he hated it.
When they got to the grammar schools here, they were the elite. And if, of course, you'd managed to get to a scholarship, you were the elite of the elite.
All his life, Lewis felt it was immoral to be part of an elite. He was embarrassed to wear his Cowbridge blazer back home amongst the colliers' children in Cumberland. As a young man, his strong moral code gave him a heartfelt loathing for war. In 1938, with conflict seeming inevitable, he'd publicly professed his pacifism in an article called "Will I Fight?" He wrote, "I could hit a man with my fist, but I could not stick a bayonet in him. I cannot see that one is justified in enlisting." In 1939, he fell in love with Gweno Ellis, who was to prove his inspiration, but their courtship was cut short by the outbreak of war. Lewis the pacifist enrolled as 1883697 Sapper Lewis of the Royal Engineers. He tried to remain true to his principles by volunteering for a regiment where there seemed the least likelihood of having to kill.
This is the Railway Training Centre in the Great Army Camp in Longmoor in Hampshire. Alun Lewis arrived here in May 1940 to learn the art of being a soldier. He hated military life. He hated the claustrophobia, the enforced comradeship, the routine, which is a sensitive and often depressed intellectual, he found extremely irksome.
Wrenched away from home, Lewis wrote almost daily to Gweno.
The army has inoculated me, issued me with the usual soldier's tunic and shirt and trousers, 3 pairs of socks, 5 brushes, a cleaning cloth, shaving tackle, 2 towels, and a greatcoat.
Route marches. Boots marching up and down again. Yes, we did route marches. 7 o'clock in the morning, we were doing PE.
Live, active and muscular men well equipped for duty in the army. They can manhandle 180-pound tree trunks as if they were made of matchwood.
We did exercises. We ran around the place. And with no enemy, we wondered sometimes what the devil we were guarding.
This is a letter he wrote May 24th to Gweno from Longmoor. I'm trying to find a means of living, not from day to day, for that's agony, but for a long time. For I can't get back to you now. You too have married Adolf Hitler. Longmoor, June 1940. Routine, drill, 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 rain. I feel unhealthy and fed up with my continual failure to digest army food. Being allowed to do nothing is dangerous.
Wake up that man in the front rank!
The Sentry, written in 1940, mirrored the bleakness of his spirit. I have begun to die, for now at last I know that there is no escape from night. I have left the lovely bodies of the boy and girl deep in each other's placid arms, and I have left the beautiful lanes of sleep that barefooted lovers follow to this last cold shore of thought I guard. I have begun to die. Lewis would escape here to Steep, a few miles from the camp, where he contemplated the monument to Edward Thomas, a poet who was killed at Arras in 1917. This place inspired one of Lewis's most famous poems. It portrays a man who had passionately loved his home and his wife, but who has been rendered numb and indifferent. All day it has rained, and we on the edge of the moors have sprawled in our bell tents, moody and dull as boors, and we stretched out unbuttoning our braces, smoking a woodbine, darning dirty socks, reading the Sunday papers. And we talked of girls and dropping bombs in Rome, and thought of the quiet dead and the loud celebrities, exhorting us to slaughter and the herded refugees. Yet thought softly, morosely of them, and as indifferently as of ourselves are those whom we for years have loved and will again tomorrow maybe love. But now it is the rain possesses us entirely, the twilight and the rain. After more than a year in Longmoor, Lewis confessed to Gweno that he no longer considered himself a pacifist, nor was he prepared to take orders from those he did not respect. In October 1942, Alun Lewis joined the South Wales Borderers as an officer and was bound for Burma and action against the Japanese. So we must say goodbye, my darling, and go as lovers go forever. Tonight remains to pack and fix on labels and make an end of lying down together. I put a final shilling in the gas and watch you slip your dress below your knees. Yet when all's done, you'll keep the emerald I placed upon your finger in the street, and I will keep the patches that you sewed on my old battle dress tonight, my sweet. Alun Lewis never saw Gweno again. In December 1942, he arrived in Bombay.
The largest convoy ever to leave Britain brings a great armed host to the shores of India. Thousands of troops throng the decks, eager to get their first glimpse of land.
It was extremely hard to be dragged away, stuck 6,000 miles away, where nobody knew what we were fighting for anyway out there. And for the first month, all the men talked about was sex. God, I'd like to think of Marilyn Monroe. Betty Grable was there. The second month, all they could talk about was food. And then after the first 2 months, all they talked about was survival.
For Lewis, the hardship was compounded by the fact that the regiment now knew him as a published poet. All Day It Has Rained had appeared in Lilliput magazine.
There was the sort of normal, rather rough, tough soldier view. What on earth is a poet doing here? You know, what we need here is soldiers.
But the elegant surroundings of Mrs. Aykroyd's home in the southern Indian hills offered Lewis some longed-for respite.
We used to have soldiers on leave, some invalids. We had one Chindit, poor chap who used to scream all night because he imagined himself in the Chindit jungle. And they were ill and they would just have a holiday. If they weren't, they loved it. You see, one had so many servants, awful though they very often were, but I had 14, if you can believe it. And so it wasn't a burden in that sense. And I was on the top veranda when the butler, so-called, appeared at the door and said, "There's an officer, sir." So I said, "Show him up." I had no idea who it was, and it was Alun Lewis. He looked so little like an officer or a soldier. He looked entirely like a poet. He was very beautiful, very shy. And that was Alun in his khaki with shorts up to above just to the knees. Hideous, really.
Alun Lewis and Mrs. Aykroyd fell in love.
Everybody danced all the time in India. Always dancing in the clubs. There were always dances. And yes, I can remember dancing. He didn't dance very well. I used to have the gramophone, as we called it then, which is an upright thing you wound, brought out onto the lawn. And we'd play that. How absurd when I think of it. It must have looked very silly, but we were very happy doing it.
Don't sigh, my love, smile.
He had a record called Let Me Weep, and I cannot think who it was by. And his first letter when he left said, "I'm thinking of Let Me Weep and the music we played, but I have no desire to weep, but only to sing and dream." He was only with us for about a week, and then he went to Ratan Tata because Wallace was coming back. I didn't feel that Wallace should come back and Alan be there, so I packed him off to Ooty and he went to Ratan Tata.
Lewis found it impossible to reconcile his love for his wife Gweno with deep feelings for Freda.
There was a certain stigma if an officer had an affair, but it was Alun himself who felt the stigma. The whole relationship and the whole emotional confusion of it disturbed him deeply.
He wrote me a letter about his depressions, which was unbelievably moving, upsetting, and it was about the terrible Arab moonscape in which he wandered. Death, he brooded on it all the time. Sometimes I think he saw it as a fulfillment.
In his poem Burma Casualty, Lewis wrote, "Lying in hospital, he often thought of that darkness. Your leg must go? Okay, the surgeon said. Take it, he said. I hate the bloody thing." Yet he was terrified, not of the knives, nor losing that green leg. He'd often wished he had a gun to shoot the damn thing off, but of the darkness he knew would come, and bid him enter its deep gates alone. Lewis's intense affair with Frida had lasted only a few weeks.
I remember leaving him, he stood on Poona station with his head bowed as though he'd been poleaxed, and I think he was extremely unhappy. He wrote later he felt he had lost something he simply couldn't find, and he wanted it so much on the platform and didn't have it.
The man who had already spent so much of his war in waiting had to linger another 6 months before his regiment moved into action. For Keith Douglas, the Battle of El Alamein lasted 3 weeks. In 80 days, the 8th Army had advanced 1,400 miles, a feat unparalleled in military history. The battle also left 25,000 Germans killed or wounded. It's in the poem Vergiss mir nicht that Douglas describes coming across one of the German dead. He thinks about the dead man's girlfriend looking at her lover's corpse.
But she would weep to see today how on his skin the swart flies move, the dust upon the paper eye, and the burst stomach like a cave. For here the lover and killer are mingled, who had one body and one heart, and death, who had the soldier singled, has done the lover mortal hurt.
The Sherwood Rangers were awarded 4 military crosses and 2 military medals. Douglas, who'd been so scathing about the aristocrats in his regiment, had found a new respect for their old-fashioned values.
Peter was unfortunately killed by an 88. He took his leg off. He died in the ambulance. When I saw him crawling, he said, "It's most unfair. They've shot my foot off. How then can I live among this gentle, obsolescent breed of heroes and not weep? Unicorns, almost, for they are fading into 2 legends in which their stupidity and chivalry are celebrated. The fool and the hero will be immortals."
In Alamein cemetery alone, there are the graves of over 7,000 Allied soldiers. The bodies of a further 12,000 men were never found.
I would know how many I'd buried, but I mean, in a battle there was a lot more killed than I could bury. I dealt with what I could, but I couldn't clear a battlefield.
Always had that back of mind. Wouldn't like to be buried there. We used to dig some of the holes, you know, and all they did was in a blanket, and the old padre used to stitch him up in a blanket. Never right.
These are the closing words of Douglas's war memoir, Alamein to Zem Zem.
We had made it. We stood here on the safe side of it, like swimmers, and Guy, lying under the flowers in Infidaville Cemetery, Piccadilly Gym, buried miles behind us, Tom and all the others back to the first casualties during Rommel's attempt to break through to Alexandria. They didn't make it, but it's over for them too.
In February 1944, poet Alun Lewis and the South Wales borderers found themselves in Burma. The regiment, which had seen no action, was at last destined for the front line. Lewis was still struggling with his belief that it was wrong to kill.
The Japanese had no compunction at all of killing you. And they did it sometimes in a very nasty manner. And we knew it. I mean, there's no question of prisoners. No way.
If you came in contact with the enemy, you killed him, and that's what soldiers were for. But of course, the soldier was the very last thing you could describe Alun Lewis as.
His letter said, "I'm no weakling, and I'm perfectly able for any spot of murder that may come my way." This was sarcasm. But I do think a great deal about death. I'm not taking life casually because its lease is short. He wrote half the night, endless letters to his family and me. He hardly slept. "I have begun to die, and at last I know there is no escape from night. I have left the lovely body of the boy and girl close in each other's placid arms. I have begun to die."
On the 4th of March 1944, the regiment came close to contact with the Japanese at the Gopi Pass. Lewis asked permission to leave HQ to join the forward company on the top of a nearby hill.
I think what he was doing was just challenging himself. I think he had said to himself, "I've got to find out whether I can do this or not."
He told me he was going off, you know, and I said, "Well, what for?" And he said, "Oh, I'm just going out on patrol, and I want to have a look at the countryside up at Gopi and get it." And off he went. And the next thing we heard was that he'd been shot. That's what we heard.
I received a message saying that there'd been an accident and that Lieutenant Lewis was dead.
Lewis was found with a pistol wound to the head.
I immediately suspected that either there had been an accident or the worst scenario of all, that he had decided that he couldn't face this situation and had decided to put an end to his life.
2 weeks after his death, a court of inquiry was held. There were no witnesses. The inquiry concluded death was accidental.
The battalion thought that he had killed himself because he was a sensitive person, or at least some of them thought it. But I find it extremely hard to believe, and I don't believe that he killed himself.
Tilly remembers our driving up in the car. We had a very, very long drive up to our house and looking at the letters on the seat beside me and my saying, "On earth that from a very simple writing, who can it be?" And getting out of the car, taking the letters up to my bedroom, where my husband was standing in the doorway of the balcony, when I opened this letter. And I read it and was terribly sort of sad, wept in Wallace's arms. And I remember he went out onto the balcony and leaned over it and looked into the garden saying, "What a waste, what a damn waste." He was very fond of Alan. What a waste, indeed.
Back in Wales, Gwenno Lewis was told of her husband's death by telegram.
"I have begun to die, and at last I know there is no escape from night. I have left the lovely body of the boy and girl close in each other's placid arms. I have begun to die.
Late in 1943, Keith Douglas came home from the Battle of Alamein.
When I got home, there he was. It was just lovely. Hello, you're back.
Yes, Keith's home.
He brought us, do you remember, a large box of very squashy Turkish delight.
Wasn't it lovely? Because we had
Wasn't it
no
lovely?
sweets were around, and it was lovely.
He was browner and tougher in a sort of way, but really just
But in
exactly
a way,
the
gentler.
same.
He was gentler.
In his absence, Keith Douglas had become a published poet. At the Appletons, he continued to write.
He started to write Alamein to Zem Zem, a lot of it in our house, and drawing a lot of those drawings. He lay on the floor to do that in front of the fire, like a sort of schoolboy.
After 3 short weeks of leave, Douglas was back in training for D-Day. He went absent without leave to visit his London publishers, Poetry London.
It seemed as though he wanted to tie everything up if he could. That's the feeling I got from him. He wanted to know what had happened to his poetry and whether they were going to publish it or not, you see. I felt an urgency about him, which was, I could understand it really, because he also believed very strongly that he was going to be killed. And I used to say, oh, don't be so silly, as one would, you know. We just had some beer, and then we had a couple of dances. He said, let's go around the world together. So I said, yes, that'd be nice. And then he had to go back again. I did think he thought he was in love with me. He wrote one very long letter asking me to go to bed with him, which I was very touched by, really. He wanted to go to the Grosvenor Hotel. I'm going to ask you in a letter if you will stay a whole weekend with me before the second so-called front opens. It would be marvellous to be in a room with you and shut the door on all the problems and perils of both of us. You will probably feel that actually sleeping together will only make you another complication, and I don't suppose you want to sleep with me anyway. When a soldier going off to war, you know, it's the old story, isn't it?
He used to say to quite a few of us, you know, why don't you marry me? Because I'm going to die and somebody might as well have my pension. It wasn't a serious thought of marriage. It was a fact of don't waste a widow's pension because I'm going to die.
He attended evensong at church on the last Sunday before the D-Day landings. He was the only soldier in church on that evening.
It's the 6th of June 1944. Keith Douglas lands here with the Sherwood Rangers, his regiment, on Gold Beach. This is the poem Keith wrote as he was waiting for the D-Day landings, and he never lived to complete it. Actors waiting in the wings of Europe, we already watch the lights on the stage and listen to the colossal overture begin. For us entering at the height of the din, it will be hard to hear our thoughts, hard to gauge how much our conduct owes to fear or fury. Everyone, I suppose, will use these minutes to look back, to hear music and recall what we were doing and saying that year, during our last few months as people. Near the sucking mouth of the day that swallowed us all into the stomach of a war.
We'd gone not a great distance inland a few snipers around and that sort of thing. And I think my driver must have had his head out of his driving position, and he got sniped. And that was all hell to pay. And then Keith Douglas came along. He said, "Jackers, what the hell are you about?" or something to that effect. And I said, "I'm afraid my driver's been badly wounded. Could you give me a hand? Perhaps we could get him on the back of our tank." I think that was almost the last time I saw him to talk to him as a close friend.
The Sherwood Rangers pushed on through Normandy, the first to liberate Bayeux. They then pressed inland through the countryside beyond. On D-Day +3, they arrived outside the village of Tilly.
On this little road in Normandy, between the wheat fields, we come to the last few hours of Keith Douglas's life. He and a comrade, John Bethel Fox, got out of their tanks and skirted back along this road to the little village of Saint-Pierre, which is full of Germans. A mortar shell exploded directly above Keith Douglas's head, and it killed him instantly. There wasn't a mark on his body. He's somehow immaculate, unstained, perfect. This is the Padre casualty book, his book of the dead. And on 9th of June 1944, he records where Keith Douglas fell.
I buried him close beside the hedge near where he was killed. There was no possibility of doing otherwise. I just took an ordinary army blanket, wrapped it round him, head to foot, stitched him in it. Being quite alone and reading the brief order of service over the grave affected me deeply.
The message came through to me, your friend Keith Douglas has unfortunately had it. Don't quite know what he was doing. Getting out a recce, I think, of some sort, which he was capable of doing. I mean, he was very brave. Yes, I was very sad when I heard the news.
How did you get to hear it?
Through through regimental headquarters, I think.
I saw the notice in the Times, and it was just awful. Just there it was in the sort of casualties. I really was sort of overwhelmed. I just felt sort of curiously dizzy.
I don't know that I felt particularly sad, you know, because people getting killed all the time. It's only subsequently, but that one, you know, gets overwhelmed by these feelings of futility and loss, really. As somebody having so much to offer our country and our language, and just tossed aside for nothing.
I think he's one of the best things that happened to me in my life. I think of it as happiness. I think of it as happiness. I didn't cry then, and I don't think I shall cry now.
Now in my dial of glass appears the soldier who is going to die. He smiles and moves about in ways his mother knows. The wires touch his face. I cry now, death, like a tears, and look, has made a man of dust of a man of flesh. For here the lover and killer are mingled, who had one body and one heart, and death, who had the soldier singled, has done the lover mortal hurt. How easy it is to make a ghost.
Mitch Murray is in Dictionary Corner, making those words and numbers count next.
No, Joshua! Stop it!
Super Nanny is back.